Hello for the folks that joined a little bit early. Appreciate you doing that. Before we get things kicked off, we're a couple minutes out yet. I'd like to do a quick audio check. I think we've got Sam, you're on. So Bill, if you don't mind, give me a quick check 1, 2, 3. And then if Sam, you could verify you're hearing both of us, that'd be great.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Great, thank you very much for that. All right, audio checked out, which is good. Again, folks, we are 2 minutes out from the start of the session, so just hang back for a minute, and we'll be right back on to start with some kind of pre-webinar announcements and then get things kicked off. So thanks for your patience. We'll be right back on. Bill, you can mute yourself for now. All right, folks, we're going to get a few things kicked off here. Again, I want to thank you for joining early. My name is Kevin Miller. I'm here with Astrix today, and I'm going to kind of MC today's session. So we're just about a minute out. You should hopefully be seeing main slide on your screen. We did an audio check, good there. So today's session also carries with it some CEUs. So we'll be reaching out to explain how to take advantage of those. I do want to encourage everybody to ask questions as we go through today's session. We won't stop and answer questions as we go through. That would kind of mess up the flow of the session. But what we will do is we'll leave some room when we get to the end to go ahead and field those. We'll record today's session as well. So if you want to share this with anybody in your organization after today, you'll be welcome to do so. I believe there's also a mechanism by which you can get the CEUs as a result of the recording. But again, we're glad to have you here live. We're going to go ahead and start the recording and get the session kicked off. And again, for asking questions, there's a little panel on the right-hand side of your screen, Q&A. Ask them as we go through. So if something's top of mind, just type it in. When we do hit the questions at the end, we won't read your name and we won't read your company or anything along those lines. All we'll do is I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's live webinar entitled What You Should Be Testing For in the Hiring Process, which is understanding current trends on drug testing, laws, and legislation. Today is presented by Current Consulting Group and Astrix. And again, I thank everybody for joining us today. We go to the next slide. Before we get into the content, I do want to take a moment and just introduce a little bit about who Astrix is and why we're presenting with everybody today. Just give you a chance to get a little bit more familiar with us. As a company snapshot, a couple of fast facts. We were established in 1995. We are a consulting and services firm. We can go back to the next slide, just one sec, Bill. We are a consulting and services firm that deals a lot with different technologies as well as staffing. We operate from locations in the United States and overseas and have over 1,200 employees, greater than 90% of which hold advanced science degrees. We are a science-based company providing science-based services. We work with startups, life science enterprises, Fortune 1000 companies, chemical, CPG, government agencies, and research institutions. And we can go to the next slide now. In terms of the services that we offer, there's an end-to-end services offering, which we like to say helps accelerate digital transformation and optimize performance across your ecosystem. This is really going to span everything from helping companies with strategic innovation, enterprise architecture, selecting different technologies from which they can use. So we do a lot of technical consulting here at Astrix, everything right up through computer systems validation and supporting, the different technologies and systems that we help companies put in place in their laboratories. At the end of that, we also get into staffing, and we can operate staffing as a completely standalone service. This is everything from staffing technical folks to staffing your laboratory or staffing your R&D department. So again, a wide array of services which we kind of wrap staffing around. We can add staffing as a service at the end of engagements or as part of engagements, or we can operate staffing as a completely standalone service, which we have done for many, many years here at Astrix. And we can go to the next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to introduce Bill Current. Bill is the president and founder of CCG Group, leading expert on drug testing and the drug testing industry. Bill founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998, and he's become one of the number one recognized brand names in compliance and business development consulting in the drug testing industry. I won't go through and read verbatim everything there, Bill. What I'll do is I'll turn this over to you, and I'm going to sit back with the rest of the audience and enjoy the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. I just first want to just do a little shout out to Astrix for hosting today's and sponsoring today's webinar presentation. Not everybody in the business does this kind of educational outreach, and so I want to just tip my hat to Astrix for doing this and for inviting us to participate in this particular presentation. As Kevin mentioned, I've been doing this for a long time. I got into the drug testing industry business sort of before it really was an industry. Back in the late 80s, I was working at the US Chamber of Commerce, and we started an organization there called the Institute for a Drug-Free Workplace, and I eventually became the director of that coalition, and that was sort of my start. And then I started this company, Current Consulting Group, in 1998. So we're actually celebrating our 25th anniversary. And as a part of that, we're really pleased to be making some presentations this year on sort of where we're going with drug testing. Now, we specialize in workplace drug testing for employers in all industries, and I want to kind of just walk you through the agenda for today and invite you to ask any questions that you have. This is the agenda we'll follow, but I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you have about drug testing, drugs in the workplace, particular drug testing methods. As many of you may know, the U.S. Department of Transportation just recently issued a final rule for lab-based oral fluid drug testing. This is a major development in the world of drug testing because for more than 30 years, DOT only permitted lab-based urine testing and was really sort of closed off to any new innovations and emerging technologies. And so for the first time in 30 plus years, both the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, and DOT have issued final guidelines. These are in effect. Now, the DOT regulations are pending the certification of at least 2 laboratories to be able to conduct lab-based oral fluid testing. But the final rule went into effect on June 1st. So it's now in effect, although not usable quite yet, but we anticipate that will perhaps happen even before the end of the year. So we're going to talk about the magnitude of the drug problem, which drugs you should test for in 2023. We'll talk about some common mistakes that employers make when it comes to drug testing. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to strengthen the legal defensibility of your workplace drug testing program. So let's start out with the magnitude of the problem. Excuse me, and any discussion about drugs in the workplace, drug abuse in America, et cetera, has to start with marijuana. This is the map that shows the status of legal marijuana states. So the orange states, California, Oregon, Washington, along the Pacific coast there, and then all the way across the map, those are the states that have legalized marijuana for so-called recreational or adult use. The states in blue are the states that have legalized marijuana for medicinal use. But it's important to point out that the orange states all have medicinal marijuana laws as well as recreational marijuana laws. So I think we're up to about 20 states now that have legalized recreational use of marijuana. The states in white have not yet either legalized medical or recreational marijuana use, but some of those states, many of those states have actually decriminalized the possession of personal amounts of marijuana. So you can see how the legalization movement has spread across the country. Now, in the early mid, late 70s, the issue for legalization had to do with all drugs, heroin, cocaine, etc. But there was really no appetite for that across the country. And so the emphasis within the legalization movement focused on marijuana, and there was no real appetite for that either in the 1980s. So then the argument became medical marijuana, the compassionate availability of marijuana for people suffering with various diseases and chemotherapy and things of that nature. And that's where they really found their footing. And now it's spread to, recreational use. But all the way over to the left of the map, Oregon became the first state to decriminalize the personal amount possession of all drugs, heroin, cocaine, etc. Doesn't mean that they're legal in those states. It just means that law enforcement in the state of Oregon will not punish somebody if they possess a personal use amount of, say, heroin or cocaine. Now, there was a report that came out about 2-3 weeks ago that showed that they're starting to have buyer's remorse in Oregon because of some, obvious, predictable negative consequences of that decision. However, the point in bringing it up here is that as states legalize marijuana and, in the case of Oregon, decriminalize all drugs, it results in more people using drugs. The legality or the illegality of drugs has been a deterrent for decades now. And when you remove that, you have more people using drugs. And as a result, I'm going to share some statistics that show that it's crept into the workplace as well in terms of positive drug test results and positive post-accident drug test results. These statistics on the screen now come from an annual report from SAMHSA called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It's been coming out since the 70s. Used to be called the National Household Survey. And this shows drug abuse by drug category, by employment status, by education status, in all kinds of different categories. It's a great report, a lot of data in there, and employers can use it to really get a feel for which drugs they should be testing for. As you can see here, marijuana is the #1 illicit drug that's used by Americans. Now, it's not more than alcohol. Alcohol is still, at the top of the list in terms of intoxicating substances that people use, but marijuana is #1 among illicit drugs. And I call it illicit drugs, even though it's been legalized in so many states, because under federal law, marijuana is still considered illegal. It's still a Schedule I controlled substance, along with cocaine and heroin as 2 of its examples. And that means that there's no medical use for the drug, and that the drug is subject to abuse and addiction. And so it remains illegal at the federal level. However, as you can see here, the rate of people using or admitting to using marijuana has gone up significantly since 2020. Now, this report always lags behind by a year or two. So the 2023 report, when it comes out, will reflect 2022 data, or excuse me, it will reflect 2021 usage that was collected in 2022 in the survey and then reported in 2023. So it's always at least 1 year behind. But it's a good snapshot of where we're at in terms of substance abuse by drug. And you can see marijuana is #1. And of course, going from 17.9% to 18.7% in 1 year is significant because we're talking about tens of millions of people. And so the overall pool of the number is huge. And therefore, an increase of nearly 1% is a lot of additional users. Now, this is a little bit hard to see, but basically this divides the SAMHSA report into age categories for marijuana use. So you can see right in the middle, that's the 18 to 25-year-old category from the survey. So when they do the survey, one of the questions they ask is, how old are you? What's your age? And so marijuana use is highest among those 18 to 25. And you can see it's increasing. It's also increasing among those 26 and older. And the reason for that is because that age category, 26 and older, is graduating from the most use category, 18 to 25. But if you're hiring young people, if you're in the fast food industry, in the construction industry, and other industries that tend to hire young adults, then you're dealing with an age category, a demographic, where marijuana use is not only the highest, but it's also increasing year over year. So that's important to know if you're an employer. It doesn't mean that marijuana is the only drug that we should be looking at. Now, these are statistics that came from one drug testing company in our industry, and it's in full disclosure, this was just their 2020 experience. So we're in full COVID pandemic mode when these statistics were reported. But this one company, a company that does millions of drug tests a year, reported that marijuana positives on the far left were up compared to the year before by about 20%, but also very significantly, opioid positive results, and these are from random drug tests. Opioid positives were up almost 274% in 1 year, and amphetamine positives were up over 215%. Now, this, of course, was during the height of the pandemic, 2020. But it's significant because look all the way to the right, the orange bar representing amphetamine positives was actually higher for the first time in the history of this company, a company that, again, does millions of drug tests a year. It was higher than marijuana positives, never seen before. So you can't just focus on marijuana, you've got to look at all the different drugs. But marijuana is, I think it's fair to say, it's fueling the overall increase in substance abuse in America. Part of that is because marijuana use is up. You can see the stat over there to the right. But significantly, also part of that SAMHSA survey, they ask about perceived risk of harm in using marijuana, smoking marijuana. That's significant on a weekly basis. And you can see that that has declined from 36% in 2015 to 26% in 2021. That's significant. As the fear of any kind of risk of harm goes down, then usage goes up. And so we're seeing in the last category there, over 2.6 million people admitting that they used marijuana for the first time in 2021, according to the latest SAMHSA National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So perceived risk of harm is down, more people try marijuana for the first time, and as a result, overall marijuana use has increased in the United States. And that's from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. So that's a very reliable, legitimate source of information. I won't go through all of these statistics, but I do want to go down to the last one, because this is about the increase in drug use generally, and then marijuana specifically. But look at the bottom one. So vaping, whether for smoking purposes or for drug use purposes, but vaping has become quite a sensation in the United States. And it's important to note there that 36.4 million people admit to vaping marijuana in the last year. That's 40% of all the people who say that they vape. So they're vaping in place of cigarettes in some cases. They may be vaping other substances, but 40% of those who vape say that they vape marijuana. So that's also becoming a trend to watch, because it's an alternative way to consume the drug that may on the surface appear to be not using the drug, but in reality, it's just as potentially dangerous and impairing as somebody who smokes a cigarette joint. Now, Quest Diagnostics is the largest drug testing company in the drug testing world. As part of the current consulting group, we do a survey of the drug testing industry every year. We just released the results a couple of weeks ago at the National Annual Conference of NDASA, which is the National Association of Drug and Alcohol Testing. And Quest was voted the #1 recognized brand in the world of drug testing. Now, they're a big, huge corporation, billions of dollars in revenue, and a big slice of that, but small by comparison to their total revenue, is drug testing. And part of that is drug testing in the workplace. However, they release a report every year called the Drug Testing Index on the positivity results from their drug testing the previous year. Now, they're doing up to 9 million drug tests a year. They're the largest, okay? And positivity rates for marijuana, the first bullet there, in the general US workforce, not counting DOT drug tests, on more than 6.3 million just in the non-DOT world, saw an increase in positives of 8.3% between 2020 and 2021, and then further increasing by 31.4% in 2022. So an increase was already trending, and then a dramatic increase between 2021 and 2022. The highest positivity rate ever reported in the history of the Quest Drug Testing Index. Look at that third bullet. Over a 5-year period, positivity for marijuana in the general U.S. workforce, again, not counting DOT tests, increased 53.6% total. Now, the next bullet is key. Marijuana positivity increased from 2021 to 2022 in states with legal recreational marijuana laws, 11.8% and 8.3% for medical marijuana, but only 3.3% in states with no legal marijuana. So it surged in these recreational marijuana states and was relatively low, below the overall average of positive tests in states that had no legal marijuana laws, which is a shrinking list, of course, but it's still about 30 states that have not legalized recreational marijuana. Now, one study that was done this was done in 2021, but I think it's still significant, so I continue to refer to it. This was a study that was done after the first year of the pandemic. So a full year into the pandemic, found that 49% of workers, so this was specific to the workplace, admitted to struggling with alcohol and drugs. If you look at that, I'm not going to try to paraphrase it. Let me just read the italicized part. Of the 49% of workers who reported struggling with some level of addiction, the number of workers reporting lower productivity or missed work because of substance abuse or addiction had nearly doubled since 2019, with 36% further reporting that it has affected their work more since the pandemic started. And nearly half of full-time workers now report problem use of alcohol, drugs, prescription drugs. 19% report weekly usage of these drugs. Now, let me ask you, you don't have to respond, obviously, but if you'd like to ask a question in the chat section, feel free to do so. But how many of those people, that increase in worker drug abuse, have sort of magically stopped using drugs or alcohol or abusing alcohol, let's say, because
Hey, folks, I think we might have lost some audio. Could
right there.
correct.
So let's continue sort of where we left off. And let me share one other statistic and then we'll get on with this. So as marijuana use increases across the country, we're seeing a corresponding increase in alcohol abuse as well. And so this was one study that came out in 2021. It showed that, or may have been actually last year, but it showed that simultaneous use of marijuana and alcohol is far greater than people, that number is far greater than people who just use marijuana or just abuse alcohol. And so if you're an employer, you're concerned about substance abuse in the workplace, you want to keep an eye on that, because if you have workers who are maybe abusing alcohol and coming to work intoxicated, they're likely also using marijuana, and they're probably doing it at the same time. So that sort of finishes that part of it. Let's talk about the drugs of abuse, okay? One of the most common questions that I get asked is, which drug should we test for? And I always tell people, test for the drugs that people use, but know what those drugs are. And so it would be, in my opinion, a very, very bad business decision to not test for marijuana, because there is that temptation with the legalization movement, making marijuana use much more common. But I think it would be a bad business decision, because the rate of marijuana positives, particularly among positive results from post-accident tests, which I'll share in a minute with some statistics, is increasing significantly. But I think it would also be dangerous to not test for other drugs. And so let's talk about some of those other drugs that come into play. And as sort of a primer to that, just as a reminder, a drug test panel, a term that you hear a lot in the world of drug testing, is referring to the drugs that you're testing for. And so there are various laws and regulations and considerations that will sort of influence which drugs you test for. There's state laws that come into play. The federal regulations are very specific about which drugs you can test for and must test for under the DOT regs, for example. And then the type of work that people are doing. The drug testing method, whether it's lab-based or rapid result, will have an effect on which drugs can be tested through the particular method or device that you're using. And then it may come down to corporate culture, whether or not you want to test for marijuana as an example. The drugs that are included in a typical SAMHSA drug test panel are amphetamines, which includes amphetamines and methamphetamines, cocaine, marijuana, opiates, and phencyclidine, which is PCP. That's considered the standard 5-panel drug test. Now, some years ago, DOT, or SAMHSA, excuse me, but it affected the DOT regulations, basically expanded the panel to include what they call an expanded opioid panel. So it's still called a 5-panel test under the DOT regulations, but it actually includes hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, and oxymorphone, as well as confirmation testing for 6-AM, 6-amylomorphine, which is the biomarker that is specific to heroin. So if somebody tests positive in a confirmation test for 6-AM, then that's proof positive that they used heroin. There's no way around that conclusion. Other drugs that people commonly test for, alcohol, of course, barbiturates and benzodiazepines in particular. Those are the most common additional drugs that employers test for. So whether you consider the SAMHSA panel a 5-panel test or a 7-panel test, if you add barbiturates and benzodiazepines to it, then you're really looking at, say, a 7, but really a 9-panel test. And that's fairly common now outside of the DOT regulations. Now, I'm going to put on the screen the picture of 2 of my past favorite rock and roll stars, Tom Petty on the left and Prince on the right. And the reason I put their pictures on there is to just sort of dramatically draw attention to the fact that the opioid crisis is very significant, and it typically involves fentanyl. So both Prince and Tom Petty died from quote unquote accidental overdoses of opioid painkillers. And in both of their cases, it includes fentanyl. Now, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, considers fentanyl to be the most powerful, dangerous drug on the face of the earth, 50 to 100 times more potent than other forms of opioids. And according to some reports, 100 times more powerful than morphine. So if you've ever been in the hospital after surgery, they've got a morphine drip on because of the pain, right? I had major surgery back in December, and I wanted off of that as quickly as possible because the morphine really was powerful. I mean, I specifically told them I didn't want fentanyl, but the morphine drip I had the first day after the surgery was powerful, and I wanted off of that as quickly as possible. So I went to another painkiller and then eventually to Tylenol. But the point here is that there are some painkillers out there that are very effective and sufficient for most pain situations. But sometimes when fentanyl becomes involved in some type of an opioid combination, it's not only more powerful, more potent, but it can also become very deadly. Here's a chart. I won't spend any time on this except to say that when you look at the recording of today's presentation, spend a little time and look at the drug categories and the progression of positives by year. In some cases, like amphetamines, you're seeing a very slight increase in positive drug test results between 2021 and 2022. But again, we're talking about millions of drug tests that are being conducted. The drug testing industry estimates that there are about 40 million plus drug tests conducted every year. If we go from 1.1% to 1.2%, that would be considered a statistically significant increase, not a huge increase, but a statistically significant increase. Now look at marijuana, going from 2.5%, steadily increasing to 3.1% overall. This is beyond just the Quest drug testing numbers. But take some time to go through that and look at the trends, because that affects the decision you're going to make about which drugs to test for. Marijuana, you may not want to test for it, or may be tempted not to test for it because it's legal in so many states. Cocaine, because the cocaine epidemic of the 80s is old news, it's outdated. Heroin, because junkies don't work, they don't get jobs. Prescription drugs, because doctors prescribe them, or any other drugs that may be on the landscape. The truth of the matter is, people are abusing all of these drugs, and in many cases, if you have a worker, an employee who's using any of these drugs, then there are occasions, and maybe frequently in the case of marijuana, where they've come to work with the drug in their system. There are many reports that verify that, and in some cases, they may be impaired on the job. Now, a drug test result doesn't prove impairment, but it does increase the possibility that somebody's impaired in the workplace, because these are drugs that affect our psychomotor skills and our cognitive functions as well. So it's important to know that testing for marijuana is legal in all 50 states except New York, except under certain conditions, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. All other drugs like heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, etc., you're legally allowed to test for these drugs in all 50 states. Now, there are some states with some specific industry laws, like Illinois has a public works contractor law that dictates specifically which drugs you have to test for. In many of those states, they simply defer to that NIDA or SAMHSA drug test panel that I reviewed earlier for you. And so in those states, those would be the drugs that you would test for. But under most circumstances, you can test for most illegal drugs in virtually any state. Now, marijuana being the exception in New York, but I'm going to talk about that here in a second. So as we talk about which drugs to test for, as we talk about trends in drug testing laws at the state level or the federal regulations, it's important to note that when something changes, you've got to update your drug testing policy. And that's probably the #1 mistake that employers make that gets them in trouble down the line, by not testing for a drug that the state now requires, or testing for a drug that the state no longer allows. Those all come into play at the state law level typically. Now, again, most of you have heard about the DOT regulations that will very soon permit DOT covered employers to use oral fluid testing for the DOT regulations. So that law for DOT covered employers has specific drugs that you have to test for, and you're going to want to update your policy to reflect the fact that you've now adopted oral fluid testing, if you're going to do that, and the drugs that you're going to test for with your oral fluid drug testing program. That would be an example of a federal law or regulation that has recently changed that may affect your drug testing policy. You want to update that policy regularly, at least once a year. At the Current Consulting Group, we track state drug testing legislation. This year alone, there have been more than 600 bills introduced at the state level that would affect a workplace drug testing program if they were passed. And in some cases, we have examples now of states that have done that. California last year passed a law, and the governor signed it. It goes into effect January 1st, 2024, that would prohibit employers from testing employees and applicants for marijuana with a drug test that only shows a metabolite of marijuana or cannabis. Well, urine only shows a metabolite. It doesn't test for the parent drug like you can with blood. The only government-approved drug testing method or specimen that detects the parent drug that could be commonly used in the workplace is oral fluid testing, because you detect the parent drug in an oral fluid sample. Knowing that, if you're in California, you want to make sure that if you're going to continue to test your applicants and employees for marijuana, you want to do it with a test method like oral fluid, where you're detecting the parent drug and not a metabolite. The state of Washington just passed a similar law prohibiting employers from taking action against applicants, not employees, but applicants only, on a positive drug test for marijuana if they're using a testing method that only shows the metabolite, like urine, for example. However, the difference between Washington and California, there are several differences, but one significant difference is that the only exception to the new law in California is the construction industry, whereas in the state of Washington, there's a long list of exceptions to the new law, including a general category of safety-sensitive occupations. So if you're going to change your policy, or if you're going to change your drug testing program, or if the laws around you have changed, you need to update that policy. And at the state level, there are lots of different laws that you have to be aware of. Mandatory laws that require employers that do drug testing to comply with that law, and voluntary laws like the one we have here in Florida where I live, that only applies to companies that voluntarily choose to participate in a workers' comp premium discount program if they drug test according to guidelines from the state. Outside of those voluntary guidelines here in Florida, there is no law that prohibits, restricts, or in any way affects workplace drug testing. So under the voluntary law in Florida, Georgia, Tennessee is just 3 examples, you have to drug test a certain way, and your policy has to reflect that. So even if you're a multi-state employer and you're doing business in Texas, which is very drug testing friendly, in California, which is very drug testing unfriendly, and one of these voluntary laws, your policy would have to reflect all of those laws. And so you would probably deal with that either with separate policies or perhaps more efficiently with addendums to your main policy for the variances that exist in certain states that you do business in. And which states should you comply with? All of the ones that you do business in. Not where employees travel to do business, but where you have business operations and employees that live and work out of that operation or that facility. There's also states like California, which are very case law heavy. And so in California, they don't have a mandatory or voluntary law, except for this new law that restricts testing with urine. But they do have a lot of case law that affects things like pre-employment testing, random testing. They have a laboratory licensing law that affects where a test can be conducted and who can collect a specimen, et cetera. And then most states have workers and unemployment compensation regulations that allow employers to move to deny benefits if an individual in an accident, for example, tests positive after the accident in a post-accident drug test. Then in most states, under certain conditions, employers can move to deny benefits in a workers' comp claim, but you have to drug test according to the dictates of that workers' comp regulation. And so you want your policy to reflect those things if that's important to you. And it would be important to you, especially if you're in a safety sensitive industry. I mentioned industry specific laws like Illinois' public works contractor law. And then of course, medical and marijuana laws that are constantly in a state of flux. You can see I have 39 states and 1 territory. That's where I came up with the 40 by adding those together. And then the District of Columbia as well. But the point here is that many of those legal marijuana state laws have workplace specific language in there that you have to be aware of and you have to include in your drug testing policy. So if you're in Delaware, for example, which just passed a recreational marijuana law, then you want your policy to be updated to reflect that if you do business in Delaware. And then the federal regulations, which I talked about earlier, but those change from time to time as well. And if you're covered under one of these federal agencies like the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, which is the largest volume of drug tests under the DOT regulations, then you would want your policy to be updated to reflect that. Now, in the interest of time, let me kind of breeze through a couple of these. Not knowing why you test is important, and that's why you test, the purpose of your testing program is going to reflect how you test, when you test, and who you test. So it's very important that as a company, you identify your drug testing objectives so that you can put together a program that's geared toward achieving those objectives. And that's a mistake that many employers make. They just don't keep that up to date. For example, if workplace safety is your biggest concern, then you're probably going to not only want to do post-accident testing, but you're also going to want to do, excuse me, maybe pre-employment testing or random testing that deters drug use before the accident even occurs. Look at the second bullet, referring again to the Quest Drug Testing Index. Over the last 5 years in the general US workforce, urine drug testing, so this isn't counting DOT tests, it's not counting hair and oral fluid testing, just general US workforce urine testing, Post-accident positivity increased 22.6% between 2018 and 2022. In other words, positive drug test results are going up because more people are using drugs, which means more workers are at the workplace, probably under the influence. Again, I'm not saying that the drug test proves impairment, but it does prove that somebody's got drugs in their system, and that may more closely correlate to impairment in the workplace than somebody that's not using drugs. Look at the last bullet. Post-accident urine positivity for marijuana in the federally mandated safety-sensitive population. So these are truck drivers, pilots, train conductors, et cetera. Year over year increased by 16.7% from 2021 to 2022, and over 5 years by 40%. Now, the percentages are not large, but 1.5% to 2.1% is statistically significant. And of course, any accident that results in bodily harm or a fatality is tragic, and it doesn't matter what the percentage increase is generally in the whole world. It's what it means to your company. And if you're in a safety sensitive environment, you want your policy to reflect that. I talked about these state workers' comp regulations, but New York, which has a very kind of restrictive drug testing environment, actually allows employers to move to deny workers' comp claims if an individual tests positive after an accident. Same for Texas. So to protect yourself from respondent superior and negligent hiring lawsuits where an individual under the influence, well functioning within the scope of employment, causes an accident that results in property damage or harm to others, you want to have a drug testing program that is done correctly, it's done consistently, and when challenged, you can point to your drug testing policy, your drug testing practices, and show that as a company, we're making a good faith effort to address the problem. And for some reason, I went backwards. Let's go forward. Not knowing when to test, the different testing scenarios, pre-employment and then post-employment testing. I still think pre-employment testing is critically important, and so I highly recommend it. Companies that have discontinued pre-employment testing have seen a dramatic increase in post-accident drug test results, according to Quest and one other source. And so that's important to keep doing that, but also it serves as a deterrent to individuals who are regular drug users from even applying for a job with your company. 40% of admitted drug abusers in a government survey who were employed full-time admitted that they were less likely to work for a company that conducts random testing, and 30% said they were less likely to work for a company that conducts pre-employment testing. And then, of course, we've spent a lot of time during today's presentation talking about the different testing methods. There's lab-based urine, there's also point of collection rapid result urine, there's hair testing, and now, of course, a significant increase of interest in lab-based oral fluid testing and point of collection oral fluid testing, due primarily to the marijuana movement, which puts pressure on employers to test with a method that has a recent use detection capability, which is only possible with oral fluid compared to hair and urine, but also because DOT has now come out and endorsed it. And I think that's really sort of driving a lot of increased interest in oral fluid testing. And then, of course, not keeping your supervisors and employees in the know when it comes to any changes that you make in your drug testing policy. So always keep that in mind. And as we conclude, let's talk about 5 things you can do to strengthen the legal defensibility of your program. 1, know the laws that apply to you. Which law should you comply with if you're in multiple states? The answer is all of them. Keep your policy up to date. Use drug testing methods endorsed by SAMHSA if possible, or if you're using a point of collection device, use one that has FDA clearance, or you're doing your confirmation testing in a SAMHSA certified laboratory if possible again. And don't ignore those legal marijuana laws. Very, very important. When you look at the different drug testing methods, lab-based urine, endorsed by the federal government over 3 decades ago. Hair testing, not quite there yet, but a notice of proposed rulemaking came out from SAMHSA in 2020. And of course, SAMHSA and DOT have now endorsed oral fluid testing. And part of the reason for that is because the window of detection with oral fluid testing is the only one that overlaps 100% with the window of impairment for marijuana of 3 to 10 hours. So when you look at the various drug testing methods, only oral fluid testing covers drug use within minutes after somebody smokes a joint through that 3 to 10 hour window of detection. So I raced a little bit at the end there, but let me turn it back over to Kevin for questions, and any questions you have, I'd be happy to answer those for you.
Great, thanks so much, Bill. I'm going to go ahead and just pause